Hi everyone, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today's story is one that still gives me chills every time I think about it. We often think of nurses as the people we can trust the most, those who sit by our bedsides, comfort us in our pain, and help us heal. But what happens when that trust is betrayed in the most horrifying way possible? This is the story of Jane Toppan, later known as Jolly Jane. To the outside world, she was cheerful, kind, and adored by patients. But behind that bright smile was something much darker. Jane confessed to taking dozens of lives, some believe over 100, all while working as a nurse. And she admitted that killing brought her not only satisfaction, but pleasure. It's a case that shocked the nation, raised terrifying questions about trust and power, and left behind a legacy of fear that lingers even today. So let's go back to the beginning and unravel the disturbing life of Jolly Jane Toppan. Chapter 1. A Nurse. You couldn't trust. When we think about nurses, we usually picture compassion. Someone who holds your hand when you're scared, someone who comforts your family, someone you can trust with your life. But what happens when that trust is shattered? What happens when the very person meant to keep you safe uses that power to play God with your life and death? That's exactly what makes today's story so chilling. It's the story of a woman named Jane Toppan, later known as Jolly Jane. On the surface, she was cheerful, friendly, the kind of nurse patients loved to see by their bedside. But beneath that jolly exterior hid something far darker, a woman who admitted she found pleasure, even sexual satisfaction, in watching her patients die. Jane's case is one of those rare true crime stories that lingers long after you hear it. Not just because of the number of victims, though that number may have been over 100, but because it forces us to confront a terrifying question. How well do we really know the people we put our trust in? Her life began in tragedy shaped by loss and rejection, and it's hard not to wonder if those early wounds planted the seeds for what she would later become. But make no mistake, her crimes went far beyond survival or desperation. They revealed a twisted obsession with control, power, and the thin line between care and cruelty. So let's go back to the beginning, to the story of a girl named Honora Kelly, who the world would come to know as Jane Toppan. Chapter 2. A Childhood of Shadows. Jane Toppan wasn't always Jolly Jane. She was born on March 31st, 1854, in Boston, Massachusetts, with the name Honora Kelly. From the very start, her life was marked by hardship. Her parents were Irish immigrants at a time when Irish families faced constant discrimination. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" were common, reminding people like the Kellys that they would always be outsiders. Her mother, Bridget, died young from tuberculosis, leaving Jane and her sister Delia in the care of their father, Peter. But Peter wasn't the kind of man who could raise two little girls. He was an alcoholic known around town as Kelly the Crack or Kelly the Crackpot. People described him as unstable, unpredictable, even dangerous. The story that always gets repeated, and I still find it shocking, is that one day while working as a tailor, Peter sewed his own eyelids shut. That was the level of madness Jane grew up around. By 1863, after Bridget's death and Peter's steady decline into mental illness, he abandoned his daughters. He left Jane and Delia at the Boston Female Asylum, an orphanage for children from bad homes. That's literally what the notes in their files said: bad home. It was a blunt summary of a broken childhood. Imagine being a child and realizing that not only did your father no longer want you, but the people who were supposed to care for you reduced your life down to two words: bad home. That's the shadow Jane grew up in, and it's hard not to see how those wounds stayed with her. Her sister Delia would go on to struggle as well, battling addiction and eventually dying tragically. But Jane's path was different. She wasn't going to disappear quietly into poverty or despair. Instead, she was about to be taken in by another family, the Toppans, and while they gave her a new name and a new home, what they really gave her was a new set of scars. Chapter 3. The Toppan Household. When Jane left the orphanage, she didn't step into the warmth of a loving family. She was taken in by a woman named Anne Toppan, not out of kindness, but out of convenience. Anne wanted a servant, and to her an orphan was the perfect choice. A girl with no family ties, no inheritance, no one to protect her. someone who would be grateful for scraps. Jane wasn't legally adopted, but the family gave her their surname and even changed her first name from Honora to Jane. They wanted her to sound properly American. From then on, she was Jane Toppan, stripped of her original identity, reshaped to fit a role that others decided for her. The Toppans had a biological daughter, Elizabeth, who was close in age to Jane. On the surface, the two girls got along. They laughed together, shared secrets, even built what looked like a friendship. But beneath it, Jane lived with constant reminders of her place. Elizabeth was the daughter of the house. Jane was the servant girl. Whenever she forgot Elizabeth or her family were quick to remind her, "You are beneath us, you are Irish, you don't belong anywhere else." It was the late 1800s, and Irish immigrants were often despised. Families like the Toppans wore their superiority openly, making sure Jane knew she should be grateful for their kindness. They would say things like, "Remember where you came from. Remember no one else would take you in." That kind of daily humiliation can seep into your bones. And here's where the tension started to build. To Elizabeth's face, Jane was sweet, devoted, even affectionate. But deep down, she harbored a growing resentment. Elizabeth had everything Jane wanted: security, status, a sense of belonging. Jane had none of it. She played the part of the loyal companion, but beneath the mask, bitterness was festering. It's almost like a twisted version of Cinderella. Only in this story, Jane wasn't dreaming of a prince or a fairy godmother. She was quietly collecting grudges one by one. And later, those grudges would erupt in ways Elizabeth could never have imagined. Chapter 4: The Mask of Charm. As Jane grew into her teenage years, people outside the Toppan home began to see her as bright, talkative, and endlessly charming. She was the kind of person who could light up a room with her stories, and she quickly became the girl everyone wanted to invite to a party. Neighbors trusted her to watch their children, friends left their babies in her care, and classmates often found themselves drawn in by her wit. But that charm was a mask. Jane was what we might call today a pathological liar. She invented elaborate stories about her background, weaving tales of a father who was a sailor or a sister who had married into wealth. None of it was true, but people rarely questioned her. Why would they? She told her stories with such confidence, such ease, that most simply nodded along and believed her. Behind that mask of cheerfulness, there was another side to Jane. She loved gossip, and more than that, she loved tearing people down. If she didn't like a classmate, she would spread a rumor about them, claiming they cheated in school or that they were involved in something scandalous. Her lies weren't harmless. They often led to real consequences. Students were punished, sometimes even expelled, because of things Jane had completely made up. The most unsettling part was that Jane never got caught. Even when the rumors circled back to her, she was smooth enough to talk her way out of trouble. She could make herself look innocent while others paid the price. That kind of power, the ability to manipulate reality with nothing but words, seemed to thrill her. So on the surface, Jane was still the friendly orphan taken in by a respectable family. But in practice, she was already learning how to control people, how to bend their perceptions, and how to hide her darker impulses behind a smile. It was during these years that Jane began shaping the skills she would later use, not just to mislead and manipulate, but to kill. Chapter 5: Becoming Jolly Jane. By the mid-1880s, Jane had set her sights on nursing. In 1885, she began her training at Cambridge Hospital, and almost immediately she stood out. She was physically strong, which mattered in a time when nurses often had to lift patients or manage physically demanding care. But more than her strength, it was her personality that drew people in. Jane was cheerful, quick with a laugh, and always seemed eager to help. Patients adored her co-workers, enjoyed her company, and she gave off the impression of someone who truly loved her work. It was during this time that she earned her nickname, Jolly Jane. To everyone around her, she was the nurse you wanted by your bedside, the one who could brighten even the darkest day. But behind the scenes, something far more disturbing was unfolding. Jane had discovered morphine and atropine, two powerful drugs that could alter a patient's state dramatically. She began experimenting mixing doses to see how the body would react. Sometimes she gave enough to knock a patient out completely. Other times she gave just enough to paralyze the body, but leave the mind awake, trapped in a terrifying limbo. Jane claimed she was fascinated by the medical effects, but the truth went deeper. She enjoyed the control it gave her, the power to decide whether a person would wake up, whether they would breathe, whether they would live or die. It wasn't just about medicine. It was about domination. She started small, convincing herself that these were harmless experiments, but little by little her boundaries shifted. Soon, she wasn't just keeping patients under her control, she was pushing them closer to death, holding their hands, whispering to them as life slipped away. And the terrifying part, in a hospital where death was common, no one questioned her. Patients died all the time in the 1880s. If someone didn't make it through the night, it was chalked up to illness, not suspicion. Jane was free to play God in plain sight, and no one realized that the cheerful, smiling nurse was hiding the darkest secret of all. Chapter 6. Experiments in Death. At first, Jane may have convinced herself she was simply experimenting, pushing the limits of medicine. But it didn't take long before her experiments crossed into something darker. Patients weren't just sedated, they were dying. She discovered that by mixing morphine, which slowed the body down, with atropine, which sped the body up, she could create a terrifying push and pull inside her patients. One moment they were drifting peacefully, the next they were restless, confused, gasping for breath. She played with their bodies like they were her own private laboratory. And when those patients died, no alarms went off. Hospitals in the 1880s weren't equipped with the science we have today. Death was expected. It wasn't unusual for a certain number of patients to simply not make it through the night. So when Jane's patients slipped away, no one questioned the smiling nurse who stood loyally by their side. In fact, her devotion made her look even more compassionate. She would sit with them, hold their hands, whisper soothing words as the life drained from their bodies. To the outside world, she looked like the perfect caregiver. But Jane later admitted that those moments brought her something far more sinister. She confessed that being with her patients as they died gave her a kind of release, a thrill that blurred the line between comfort and cruelty. She wasn't easing their suffering, she was feeding her own obsession. Her co-workers noticed odd things, sometimes Jane standing unusually close over a patient or lingering too long after giving an injection, but they never imagined what was really happening. How could they? She was Jolly Jane the nurse. Everyone trusted the one who always seemed so cheerful. In reality, her double life had already begun. By the late 1880s, Jane wasn't just experimenting with medicine, she was perfecting the art of killing. Chapter 7. Freedom. Outside the hospital. Jane's dangerous games eventually started to catch up with her. Not because anyone uncovered her murders, no one even suspected that yet, but because her handling of medication became too reckless to ignore. At Massachusetts General Hospital, colleagues began to notice that she was careless with dosages. Too much morphine here, too little there. Patients reacted strangely under her care, and whispers started to spread that she wasn't as dependable as she seemed. By 1889, Jane was quietly dismissed. The official reason wasn't murder, of course. It was unprofessional conduct and incompetence with medications. Soon after, Cambridge Hospital also let her go for similar reasons, but even then, no one saw her as a killer. At worst, she was thought of as sloppy, maybe a little irresponsible. No one could imagine the truth, that she had already left a trail of bodies behind her. For Jane, being pushed out of the hospital system turned into an opportunity. She decided she didn't need the oversight of administrators or the watchful eyes of other nurses. Instead, she reinvented herself as a private nurse. Families could hire her directly to care for their sick or elderly relatives at home. And this was perfect for Jane. No colleagues, no supervisors, no hospital protocols. Just her patients, and complete control. In this new role, she flourished. Wealthy families welcomed her into their homes, praising her kindness, her cheerful attitude, and the comfort she brought to their loved ones. She became a trusted figure, often considered part of the family. What they didn't realize was that this trust gave Jane exactly what she wanted: absolute access to vulnerable people, with no one watching over her shoulder. Her double life was now easier than ever to maintain. To her clients, she was still Jolly Jane, the ideal caregiver. But behind closed doors, she was free to indulge the same twisted experiments she had started in the hospital. Only now there was nothing to stop her. Chapter 8. A House of Death. Once Jane stepped into the world of private nursing, her killing spree grew bolder. Without hospital supervisors keeping even a distant eye on her, she was free to experiment as she pleased. Her first victims outside the hospital were disturbingly close, her own landlords. Their names were Israel and Lovely Dunham. Jane lived with them for a time, and on the surface, they treated her well. But when Israel became sick, Jane decided to help in her own twisted way. She poisoned him, sat with him as he slipped away, and when Lovely was left, a grieving widow, Jane moved right in to comfort her. For nearly 2 years, she played the role of supportive companion until she poisoned Lovely too. It was a pattern Jane was perfecting, sliding into a household, becoming indispensable, and then eliminating those who stood in her way. The deaths looked natural, even expected. An old man, a grieving widow. Who would suspect cheerful Jane? But perhaps the darkest turn came when she turned her attention to someone from her own past, her foster sister, Elizabeth. The same Elizabeth she had grown up alongside in the Toppan household. Jane carried years of resentment toward her, the daughter who had everything, while Jane was reminded again and again that she was just a servant. Outwardly, they remained friends into adulthood. They exchanged visits, shared letters, and even planned a little vacation together to Cape Cod. Elizabeth never returned home. Jane later admitted that out of all her victims, Elizabeth was the one she killed out of sheer malice. She poisoned her, slowly stretching out the suffering. And when Elizabeth finally lay dying, Jane climbed into bed, held her, and whispered to her as the life drained away. For Jane, this wasn't just about control, it was revenge, but the bloodlust didn't end there. In 1901, Jane moved in with the Davis family. They trusted her completely. She was their nurse, their friend, even a caretaker for the children. She borrowed money from them, gained their sympathy, and then began dismantling the family one by one. First, Mattie Davis, the matriarch whom Jane poisoned over the course of a week. Then the youngest daughter, Genevieve. To cover her tracks, Jane spread rumors that the girl had been suicidal, planting seeds of doubt in the community. Within weeks, Jane had also killed Alden Davis, the father, and finally the eldest daughter, Minnie. She nearly erased the entire Davis family in the span of a month. This should have been the point where suspicion came crashing down on her, but Jane was clever. She invented stories, explained away the deaths, and carried on. For a while, it seemed like she might actually get away with it. What Jane didn't count on was a single watchful eye. Minnie's father-in-law happened to visit the house and saw Jane at Minnie's bedside with a syringe in hand. Later, when Minnie died, that memory gnawed at him. He knew something wasn't right. And unlike others before him, he refused to stay silent. His persistence would set in motion the investigation that finally tore Jane's carefully built facade apart. Chapter 9. Obsession and Arrest. After the Davis family deaths, Jane should have been more cautious. But instead, she grew reckless. Her next fixation was deeply personal. Ormel Brigham, the husband of her late foster sister Elizabeth, the very woman Jane had slowly poisoned out of jealousy. To Jane, winning Ormel's affection was the ultimate triumph. It would prove once and for all that she was better than Elizabeth. So she moved into his home under the pretense of helping out, acting as both nurse and housekeeper. But soon she saw obstacles, people who stood between her and the man she wanted. First, the family's housekeeper. Jane poisoned her without hesitation, taking her place in the household. Then she turned her sights on Ormel's sister, who had grown suspicious of Jane. Bit by bit, Jane dosed her with poison until she too wasted away. With the competition removed, Jane finally revealed her feelings to Ormel. But the fantasy she had built unraveled instantly. Ormel didn't love her. He didn't want her. And when she realized she couldn't win him, Jane's obsession curdled into something darker. She began slipping poison into his food and drank not enough to kill him outright, but enough to make him ill. At the same time, she threatened him, claiming she would tell the community she was pregnant with his child if he ever turned against her. It was blackmail, manipulation, and madness all rolled into one. But Ormel wasn't blind. He recognized the danger and eventually forced Jane out of his home. Enraged, Jane attempted a dramatic gesture. She poisoned herself just enough to fall unconscious, hoping it would draw Oramel back to her side. But he saw through the act. Finally, he went to the police. He told them everything, his suspicions, her threats, the strange deaths that seemed to follow wherever Jane went. On October 29, 1901, Jane Toppan was arrested. At first, authorities suspected arsenic. They searched for receipts, records of purchase, anything to tie her to the poison. But the truth was far more chilling. When investigators exhumed the bodies of the Davis family, they found morphine and atropine in their systems, the very combination Jane had perfected during her hospital years. The mask of Jolly Jane was beginning to crack. Chapter 10. Confession and Condemnation. When Jane was brought in, she didn't behave like the monster the newspapers would later describe. She walked into court wearing her nurse's uniform, the very symbol of care and trust, as if to remind everyone, I'm here to heal, not to harm. It was a calculated move, and for a moment, some people actually believed her. How could this cheerful, smiling nurse be capable of such cruelty? But the evidence was mounting. The exhumed bodies of the Davis family revealed morphine and atropine, her signature mix. Witnesses stepped forward with unsettling memories, Jane lingering over her patients dying unexpectedly in her care. And then came the psychiatrists. At first, Jane denied everything. She even claimed she was afraid of corpses, that she couldn't possibly be a killer. But under pressure, she began to talk. To one doctor, she admitted to killing 12 people. To her lawyer, she confessed to 31. And in the quiet of her cell, she whispered that the number might have been closer to 100. 100 lives extinguished by the hands of a woman once trusted to save them. What shocked people even more was the reason she gave. Jane admitted that she felt a rush, even a sexual release, when her patients died in her arms. She described slipping into bed beside them, holding them as they drifted away, whispering to them in their final moments. To her, death wasn't an accident, it was a thrill. The trial itself lasted only 8 hours. The jury declared her not guilty by reason of insanity. For some, it was justice. She was clearly disturbed. For others, it was an outrage. How could a woman who admitted to so many killings escape the full weight of the law? Jane was sent to Taunton Insane Hospital, where she would spend the rest of her life. And as her verdict was read aloud, she reportedly laughed a sound that sealed her nickname in the press, Jolly Jane. Chapter 11. The Last Days of Jolly Jane. Jane Toppan never saw freedom again. She was sent to the Taunton Insane Hospital, and at first she seemed almost proud of her new title, as one of America's most notorious female killers. Staff members noted how she spoke about her crimes without remorse, even boasting about the number of people she had killed. But time inside the asylum began to wear her down. Her mental state, already fragile, slipped further into chaos. She started seeing people who weren't there, holding conversations with invisible companions, and forgetting why she was even locked away. The woman once known for her sharp wit and dangerous cunning now wandered the halls lost in her own delusions. Jane lived a long life behind those walls. She survived into old age, her body outlasting the clarity of her mind. In 1938, at the age of 81, she died of pneumonia. For someone who had taken so many lives, her own end was almost quiet. No courtroom drama, no headline trial, just an old woman in a hospital bed slipping away like the countless patients she had once watched die. But Jane Toppan's legacy didn't fade. She is remembered as one of the first documented female serial killers in the United States, with estimates of her victims ranging from 31 to more than 100. Her story terrified the public because it struck at something so fundamental: trust. If a nurse the person meant to save you could be secretly playing with your life, then who could you truly rely on? Even now, more than a century later, her case still unsettles us. It isn't just the number of lives she took, it's the reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles, it laughs, it comforts you as you take your last breath. And that is what makes Jolly Jane so haunting. And that, my friends, is the story of Jane Toppan, the cheerful nurse who turned her patients into experiments and who found pleasure in their final breaths. Even more than a century later, her case forces us to confront some unsettling questions. How well do we really know the people we trust with our lives? Was Jane truly insane, or was she fully aware of her cruelty? And perhaps the most haunting thought of all, if she hadn't been caught, how many more lives would she have taken? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe she was America's first female serial killer, or just the most notorious one? And do you think the insanity plea was the right verdict in her case? Thank you for joining me today on True Crime Echoes. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe and share it. Helps bring more of these forgotten cases to light. Until next time, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and remember, evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles.